Ontario and Manitoba have signed a memorandum of understanding in hopes of making it easier for the two provinces to trade with each other.
We don't need them to build our cars. I'd rather see Detroit or South Carolina or any one of our Tennessee, any one of our states build the cars.
So that's going to cost not only the $4 billion, it's going to cost $30 billion of business.
28%. That's how much foreign direct investment into the U.S. dropped in just 1 year. Not due to a financial crisis, not because of a war, but because the rules kept changing. While global investors pulled out of America, Canada saw a 9% surge in new foreign investment fueled by one of the biggest trade moves of the decade, a $214 billion mega deal spanning Asia and Latin America, covering everything from mining and AI to electric vehicles and pharmaceuticals. And the fallout. For the first time in modern trade history, U.S. companies are pulling out of Canada, not because they want to, but because Washington made it too costly to stay. This isn't about loyalty anymore. It's about survival.
General Motors facility in Oshawa, Ontario is the latest Canadian auto plant to feel the effect of U.S. tariffs.
Amazon, Jeff Bezos. Sources telling CNN that the president at one point wasn't happy earlier today.
And while American tariffs continue to rise, Ottawa is doing the opposite, signing deals, building alliances, and quietly replacing the U.S. as the safe haven for global trade.
Interprovincial trade barriers are costing our national economy up to $200 billion every year.
It started with steel and ended with an unraveling. From 2023 to 2025, the U.S. didn't just increase tariffs on Canadian imports, it doubled down. Under President Trump's second-term economic agenda, duties on Canadian steel, aluminum, and automobiles surged from 25% to 50%, transforming what was once a quiet trade partnership into a political fault line. There were no negotiations, no warning shots, just a sudden sweeping escalation that sent shockwaves through the continent. And almost immediately, the consequences began to surface. In Oshawa, Ontario, General Motors, a pillar of Canada's auto manufacturing, scaled back production, citing the unpredictability of U.S. policy as a growing liability.
General Motors announcing this morning it's cutting a full shift at its Oshawa plant.
Executives didn't mince words. With cross-border components becoming prohibitively expensive, entire assembly lines were now at risk. South of the border, the impact was just as painful. The North American Automotive Manufacturers Association reported that new vehicle prices in the U.S. jumped by $1,700 to $3,000 per unit, a staggering increase that left dealers scrambling and customers walking away. Suddenly, families shopping for a mid-size SUV found themselves priced out even before adding insurance financing or maintenance. And this didn't happen in a vacuum. Inflation in the U.S. was already hovering above 4.2% in Q2 2025, according to Federal Reserve data. For middle-class Americans, costs were rising across the board, from groceries to gas to electricity. The last thing they needed was for their car payments to explode too. But this isn't just a story about prices, it's a story about trust and how fast it can collapse.
Heard from one woman who even said that the same basket of groceries that she regularly buys has now effectively...
For decades, Canada and the U.S. shared a stable, deeply integrated trade relationship.
We, as Canada, a relationship with the Americans, which were a steady process of deepening integration.
Border crossings were fast, contracts were reliable, and manufacturers on both sides planned years in advance because they could. The system worked because it was predictable. Then, almost overnight, that predictability disappeared. Tariffs went from 25% to 50% with the stroke of a pen. No review, no phase-in, just disruption. And when Canadian suppliers informed their U.S. buyers that costs would double, they weren't bluffing, they were desperate. The message was clear: Washington was now unpredictable. And in global trade, unpredictability is poison.
Walmart has already increased the cost of bananas by 8%.
As countries do deals with us, that will go to zero.
That's when the real shift began, because while the U.S. was building walls, Canada was quietly building something else. While Washington turned inward, Ottawa turned outward. By the end of 2024, Canada had made its move, and it wasn't subtle. In what analysts now call a once-in-a-generation pivot, Canada signed a $214 billion multi-sector trade agreement with a coalition of countries across Asia and Latin America. This wasn't just symbolic, it was structural. It redefined Canada's position in the global economy. At the center of that pivot was Indonesia, a resource-rich nation of over 280 million people. Together, the two countries signed a comprehensive economic partnership agreement that slashed 90% of tariffs across sectors like electronics, mining, agriculture, and energy. Suddenly, Canadian firms had direct privileged access to one of the world's most dynamic growth markets. But this wasn't just a single handshake. It was part of a larger coordinated strategy. Around the same time, Ottawa unveiled a $3 billion Indo-Pacific support package funding, everything from infrastructure to digital trade and energy transition. It sent one clear message: Canada wasn't just visiting the Indo-Pacific, it was here to stay. Behind this diplomatic blitz was a simple slogan: "We create predictability." And it resonated not just with trade partners, but with investors around the world. Because while U.S. policy was swinging from one extreme to the other, Canada was quietly offering something the markets desperately craved: stability. This wasn't branding, it was a policy doctrine. In a time of global supply chain realignment, Canada positioned itself as a reliable node, a place where companies could plan 5 years ahead, not 5 weeks. A jurisdiction where treaties held contracts stuck and leaders didn't wake up and tweet tariffs into existence. And the response: foreign direct investment surged 9% in under a year. New manufacturing hubs, AI labs, battery plants, and logistics terminals were suddenly popping up not in Michigan or Ohio, but in Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia. While the U.S. was trying to force companies to come home, Canada was quietly making itself the better home. Back in the U.S., the cracks were no longer hidden. As Canada attracted global capital, foreign direct investment in the United States collapsed, dropping 28% in less than 12 months, according to newly released data from the Department of Commerce. The reason: instability, unpredictability, and tariff whiplash. Companies in high-tech sectors, AI, electric vehicles, biotech, began rerouting. R&D centers originally planned for Texas or California were quietly shifted to Toronto, Montreal, or Singapore. They didn't hold press conferences, they just left. Meanwhile, the impact on American producers was more visible and more painful. Across the Midwest, soybean growers faced retaliatory tariffs that cut deep into their margins. In Florida, citrus exporters were hit with new restrictions in Canadian ports. In Kentucky, bourbon distillers, once booming, watched Canadian orders dry up almost overnight. But the damage didn't stop with farms and factories. Steel distributors across the country, especially in Rust Belt states like Pennsylvania and Ohio, sounded the alarm. With Canadian steel now taxed at 50%, import volumes plunged and domestic prices surged, squeezing everyone from construction firms to appliance makers. Small and mid-sized manufacturers already operating on thin margins found themselves stuck. Raw materials cost more, access to Canadian markets shrank, and yet their customers still expected low prices. Some tried to move supply chains to Mexico, but they ran into a familiar wall: bilateral tariff tensions between the U.S. and Mexico, which had also flared up under the Trump administration. The result: gridlock, not just in trade routes, but in corporate strategy. American business leaders were now spending more time navigating politics than building products. And for many, the conclusion was hard to ignore. We're paying the price for Washington's aggression. The irony was bitter. Policies meant to protect American jobs were now driving investment away from America and leaving its workers caught in the crossfire. And this wasn't a one-off, it was becoming structural. As the United States raised tariffs and closed ranks, Canada took a different path, and the results are now impossible to ignore. Over the past 18 months, Ottawa has quietly inked trade agreements with the European Union, Japan, Australia, and India, covering everything from digital services to manufacturing to climate technologies. These weren't rushed deals. They were carefully negotiated frameworks designed to last. And they weren't limited to traditional exports like lumber or grain. Artificial intelligence, strategic minerals, clean energy, advanced manufacturing. Canada wasn't just diversifying its partners, it was future-proofing its economy. The numbers speak for themselves. According to the World Bank's 2025 Global Trade Report, Canadian exports rose 2.6%, a healthy gain in a year. Many economies stumbled. In contrast, U.S. exports edged up by just 1%, weighed down by retaliatory tariffs, unstable rules, and eroding trust. And in markets where the U.S. once dominated Southeast Asia, Western Europe, Canada is now making up ground. Companies that once defaulted to American suppliers are rebalancing their contracts. Why? Because they want security. They want treaties that won't collapse with the next election cycle. And increasingly, Canada is offering that clarity while the U.S. delivers chaos. In Brussels and Berlin, in Tokyo and New Delhi, the message is landing. If the U.S. is uncertain, do business with Canada. And that message is working. This isn't just a trade story. It's a soft power story. While Washington uses tariffs to coerce, Ottawa is using agreements to attract. And in an age of shifting alliances and disrupted supply chains, attraction is often more powerful than force. Canada is no longer acting like a secondary partner. It's acting like a new hub. In Washington, they called it protection. On Wall Street, they now call it the biggest policy failure of the decade. The intent behind the tariffs was clear: bring back jobs, punish unfair trade, and boost American industry. But the outcome? It's unraveling from the inside. Because the U.S. didn't just hit foreign suppliers, it hit its own buyers. Manufacturers got slammed with cost hikes. Small businesses were priced out of key materials. And everyday consumers already squeezed by inflation were left footing the bill again. Worse, the rest of the world was watching. And what they saw wasn't strength. It was instability. In boardrooms from Munich to Mumbai, the verdict became unavoidable. The U.S. is too volatile to plan around, so companies stopped planning around it. Major global firms began diverting supply chains, shelving investments, and shifting R&D partnerships to countries like Canada, Singapore, and the Netherlands, places where rules don't change with a single executive order or overnight tweet. The U.S. was building walls, but the world was building exits. That shift is no longer theoretical. It's visible in export data capital flows and investor flight. In just 2 years, America went from being the anchor of global trade to a wild card, a liability. And for a country that once shaped the global system through trust standards and scale, becoming a source of uncertainty may be the most damaging move of all. This wasn't just a missed opportunity, it was a strategic reversal. And now in trade ministries across the globe, one quiet question keeps coming up. If America can't commit, why should we? While the U.S. builds walls, Canada opens doors. While Washington says we must protect ourselves, Ottawa responds, we're ready to connect with the world. Two neighbors, two strategies, one retreating inward, the other expanding outward, and now the consequences are global. Supply chains are moving, investors are shifting, and trust, the real currency of international trade, is changing hands. So now the question isn't just about tariffs, it's about strategy, it's about identity. Is this how you protect American manufacturing, or is this just economic self-sabotage? Let us know what you think in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to stay ahead of the next global shift.